Hi everyone. So today I'm going to talk about my final paper and kind of talk about my subject. So for my topic, I decided to focus on more diversity and equity in education. So the issue specifically that I've decided to focus on is segregation in education. It's an issue that has long been important to me. It's always kind of been my research focus since college. And so this paper allowed me a chance to kind of focus on more other legal cases that may be involved in segregation in education and the legal perspective. So to kind of give background, we these are not the two Supreme Court cases that are really important for my paper, but it's kind of the two that kind of give background. So, of course, we have Brown v. Board of Education, a case that we're all familiar with. This was the Supreme Court case that the Supreme Court ruled that segregation education was illegal. It had no place in the field of public education. And this was what kind of kickstarted um, the integration process for our schools. 10 years later, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And I have the part with federal teeth because it really is what starts to put the Civil Rights Act is the piece of law that really gives the federal government power to enforce civil rights integration. Of course, it depends on administration by administration, but the Civil Rights Act really is what I would call the federal teeth that start to be the strength in enforcing things like Brown v. Board. In fact, the Supreme Court really doesn't start pushing for, fast integration until a little bit later after Brown v. Board, when it becomes clear that there's some resistance. And the Civil Rights Act had some clauses that said, funding would be taken away from organizations that were participating in the segregation segregation segregation. So I say the Civil Rights Act kind of really started the federal teeth in enforcing integration processes. So here are the two cases that I focused on for talking about segregation in education, kind of talking about the diversity and equity perspective of it, because when we talk about segregation in education, right, diversity, equity, and this was kind of my job before, you know, a big part of our job was ensuring that everyone had the same opportunity to get, the same great education that public school can provide. And when we have segregation in our schools, it undermines the ability to provide this great education because not everyone is receiving the resources that they need or should have. So my first case is Keys versus School District Number 1, Denver, Colorado. And in this particular case, petitioners, those who were sued the Denver, Colorado schools on the grounds that they have been, implementing this illegal policy of racial discrimination by operating a segregated school system. And the district court, um, you know, kind of disagreed, disagreed and agreed at the same time, right? They were like, we see it, but it's not that strong of a case. So the question that it really went to the Supreme Court, did the segregation in Denver involve all the city schools and violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? So the conclusion is that the court ruled that when segregation is found intentionally, the burden is upon the school district to provide non-segregational practices. And so this case is important because it's one of the first cases to identify segregation in the North. The prior court, the Warren court, Earl Warren's court, really was focusing on segregation in the South. So this case was kind of important because even though we know Denver, Colorado isn't like in the North, it's out of the South. And it really began to tackle the notion that segregation is not just a Southern practice, right? And it goes beyond. Racism doesn't only just exist in the South or prejudice. No, it's everywhere. And so this case is important. Is kind of bringing that to light. So then the next case, and this one I think is even more important than the last one, is Board of Education of Oklahoma City Schools versus Dowell. And in 1972, a court ordered Oklahoma City schools to desegregate by busing the Black students to white schools. 1984, the district came up with a plan to reduce Black students' travel time, but groups complained that it was reinforcing segregation. So the question that the Supreme Court had to answer is, if a federal court deems that an injunction to desegregate schools has reached its goals, can that court dissolve the injunction? And the court ruled that yes, the court could consider removing them if the school district was making substantial progress toward their goal or met their goal. And this case really had a huge, really, I would say, was the chink in, integration efforts, because it really allowed courts to let school districts, stop or let go. And an argument that really could be made is, if they're doing it or have done it, saying, okay, well, you're good now, is only going to allow them to revert. Like it has to stay consistent. And there's a lot of cities where integration orders are put in place. And, due to this ruling, they're canceled. And then segregation in the schools is as rampant as it was in the 60s and the 70s. So to kind of really talk about the politics and how this affected national politics, I have to kind of mention what was going on at this time. So President Reagan, Earl Warren is appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, and that really starts a liberal Supreme Court overall that was pushing for just civil rights. So this had drew the ire of conservatives. So the hope was, well, next time they were like, we're going to appoint a judge. He's going to be conservative. We're not going to do this because Republicans are now at this time in the 60s and the 70s are, kind of going for more Southern strategy. And so we end up seeing the appointment of Warren Burger. And he ends up continuing a liberal court, more conservative than Warren's, of course, but Warren Burger's court continued to uphold integration practices. And so we see when Warren Burger retires, Reagan appoints William Rehnquist as Chief Justice. Rehnquist was already a court justice, but he's now Chief Justice. And so under President Reagan and subsequently President Bush, 4 years later, you see an intentional effort that really started since President Nixon, but it really ramped up under Reagan because of his Senate majority that he had until like 1987. Several conservative judges take the judiciary, and the Supreme Court really lurched to the right. Not as much as the court now, but still pretty significant. We're under the Rehnquist court. You do see a huge shift, and you can kind of see it on the chart. I mean, segregation is going down amongst Black students. And then around 1985, and this is after Rehnquist is appointed, this is, by around 1985, by 1986, I think almost all of Reagan's Supreme Court nominees he's ever appointed were on there. And you can see it goes down, and segregation is going back up. And so it was an effort amongst the court systems to really fight against this integration effort. So they kind of really talk about the effects of this, right? So here we have a map of Michigan, and you can see the racial split. So the green dots are white residents and the black dots are Black residents. And it's a stark contrast of a racial split. And so like Michigan, the state itself, has 240 most highly segregated schools with Black students. 149 of them are in Detroit, right? And so we see that rulings like the Oklahoma case really did have an effect. And I think the big problem is that from a legal perspective, the Supreme Court, I don't know if the Supreme Court, today's Supreme Court would ever make a ruling that would be so effective like Brown v. Board, but we see that Oklahoma case did have mass implications because you let states go, and then it was amongst cities and every other jurisdiction. So it is important that when we talk about equity and diversity in schools, the most important way to do it really would be to integrate our schools. And that is my presentation. Thank you.